First of all, I want to thank Inga and her free colleagues for hosting such a wonderful event. It is such a pleasure to be here with such an esteemed group of colleagues and friends, old and new. First of all, I also want to thank my colleagues Keith Wilson, David Hogue, and Beth Dooley for their guidance and support to my research. Last but not the least, I want to thank Dr. Warren Cohen and Dr. Thomas Lawton, the former director of the Freer Gallery of Art, whose work has been an inspiration for me. Today, my presentation is entitled Mammon and the Muse, International Art Dealers and Charles Lam Freer's Chinese Collection from 1915 to 1919. Charles Lam Freer, Detroit industrialist, collector, and founder of the Freer Gallery of Art, played a critical role in the history of collecting Chinese art in the United States. Freer was born in Kingston, New York, in 1854. Despite his humble beginning, Freer rose quickly to the senior management in the railroad car manufacturing business in Detroit. At the turn of the century, he retired from active business and devoted himself to art collecting. Freer gained visibility soon as a leading American collector and advocate of Asian art. When Freer died in 1919, he left the nation an enduring legacy. The future Freer Gallery of Art, the first fine arts museum devoted to Asian art in the West, and an eclectic body of American and Asian works of art. One great strength of the collection Freer bequeathed to the gallery is Chinese art. In his last 5 years, that is from 1915 to 19, his Chinese collection grew remarkably both in volume and quality. Working closely with a select group of dealers, collectors, and scholars, Freer significantly shifted his collecting focuses and methods. Today, I ask you to consider with me the complex factors that contributed to the changing field of Chinese art collecting in the context of art history, economic history, and international relations. Freer also left a uniquely rich and deep collection of art vouchers, inventories, correspondence, and photographs, which in great detail document his art collecting activities. Currently housed in the Freer and Sackler Gallery archives, these records are ideal materials for quantitative analysis of the Chinese art market conditions. The period between 1915 and 19 is critical to the formation of Freer's Chinese collection and the Chinese art collecting in the United States at large. Although Freer began to collect Chinese art in 1893, of the 3,404 Chinese objects he gave to the Freer Gallery, over 1,600 pieces, including some of the outstanding paintings, jades, bronzes, and sculptures were acquired in his last 5 years. They laid the foundation of the Freer Gallery's world-class Chinese collection today. During this period, Freer's pace of Chinese art collecting accelerated. In 1916, if you look at here, the volume of Freer's annual Chinese purchases for the gallery reached its highest point of 663 pieces since he acquired his first Chinese artwork in 1893. The growth of Freer's Chinese collection relates to important events in his life and major changes in the circulation and reception of Chinese art in the United States. In 1906, the United States government formally accepted Freer's gift. In 1915, the site of the future Freer Gallery was determined. A year later, the plans for the gallery were approved and the ground was broken. As the gallery was taking its shape, Freer became more actively involved in collection building. In 1915, Freer settled in New York City, the international center of Chinese art trade. Here, he worked closely with leading art dealers and collectors. As Kathleen Pine has observed, towards the end of his life, Freer's increased awareness of his mortality and his search for spiritual consolation in art might also have added a sense of urgency and necessity to his Chinese art collecting. Freer Chinese art collecting was part of a bigger picture. As a result of America's rise as the world's leading power at the turn of the century and the devastations of World War I that broke out in 1914 in Europe, by the mid-1910s, the International Center for Collecting Chinese Art had shifted from Europe to America. The market for Chinese art flourished in the winter of 1915 and 16, as Charles Lam Freer observed, quote, "During this time, a surprisingly large number of important specimens of Chinese art have come to New York, several which have been secured for my collection. Early paintings have been quite numerous, and I have secured one collection of 100 paintings, which friends of mine in China have been gathering since my last visit to China 5 years ago. Nearly all the museums in America of note are interesting themselves very eagerly in Chinese art, and the outlook in America for a better understanding and appreciation of Oriental art is very gratifying," end quote. Freer's observation was accurate. In 1915, the Department of Far Eastern Art was established at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The year 1916 saw the opening of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And the Cleveland Museum of Art with major displays of Chinese art. In the same year, an exhibition of early Chinese art was held at the Metropolitan Museum, where the display of Chinese ritual bronzes on loan was acclaimed as a milestone in the beginning of Western understanding of Chinese culture. In 1917, a loan exhibition was held at the Art Institute of Chicago featuring Chinese jades, paintings, and sculptures from Freer's collection. While the interest in Chinese art grew vigorously in America, the art market and the museum world on the other side of the Atlantic appeared rather bleak. In 1916, the Asian art expert Lawrence Binyong at the British Museum lamented, quote, "The museum is shut, but heaven knows when we shall ever get any grant again for making purchases, not for many years. I dare say, so we must be resigned to America getting all the fine things, to our falling hopelessly behind," end quote. The shrinking market demand in Europe prompted a group of Europe-based art dealers to turn to the United States to seek new opportunities. The prominent dealer of Chinese art, C.T. Liu, was one of them. With offices in New York, Paris, Beijing, and Shanghai, Liu supplied high-quality Chinese antiquities to major Euro-American collectors and museums for nearly half a century. Although Liu established his antique business first in Paris in 1902, his rise as a leading international dealer of Chinese art began with the expansion of his business into the United States immediately after the outbreak of World War I. In 1915, Liu opened his first gallery at 489 Fifth Avenue in New York. On the occasion of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, Liu met, probably for the first time, Charles Lam Freer, who purchased from Liu 13 paintings. From this point, Liu started to introduce Mr. Freer to a large number of important Chinese works. In 1915 and 16, Liu acquired nearly 150 pieces Freer acquired nearly 150 pieces from or through C.T. Liu at a total price of over $110,000. Another factor that contributed to the burgeoning market for Chinese art in America is the availability of a large number of high-quality works from China after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. At the time of political and financial unrest, imperial collections, important private collections, and excavated objects surfaced on the domestic and international art markets. Such a condition was observed by Freer in 1916. Quote, "Many beautiful paintings and other art objects have come here from China during the last few months. I'm sure that many Chinese collectors are now disposing of their chief treasures. Largely, I believe, on the account of general insecurity in China," end quote. In 1919, Freer paid $4,000 for this nearly 2 feet long 11th century BC jade blade with important historic inscription. This piece was owned by Duanfang, one of the leading collectors of the late Qing period. This shows the piece published in Duanfang's jade catalog. Duanfang, an important Qing official, was assassinated in a riot in 1911. His family was forced to sell a large number of pieces from his collection to dealers and collectors. In addition to their availability, Chinese works on American art market were competitive in price when compared with Japanese works or works by contemporary American artists. As Warren Cohen pointed out, that by 1914, Freer no longer focused on adding Japanese art to his collection because he found it possible to buy at lower price much finer examples by the early Chinese. In 1916, Freer spent over $306,000 on 663 Chinese pieces, including some important paintings, jades, and sculptures. In the same year, Freer purchased 66 Japanese pieces for a total sum around $2,500. In 1916, while buying an oil painting entitled Late October by contemporary American artist Dwight William Tryon at the price of $5,000, Freer paid a close sum for the hand scroll. The Shu River, attributed to Li Gongling, the first-rate 11th century Chinese painter. The hand scroll, now dated to the Southern Song dynasty or the 13th century, had a prestigious pedigree as being one of the most treasured pieces owned by the Qing Emperor Qianlong. As Freer accelerated his pace of collecting Chinese art, his focus shifted as well. He was concentrating on early Chinese art, such as paintings believed to be earlier than the Ming dynasty, ancient jades, bronzes, sculptures, and ceramics. Such a shift was both a matter of taste and a strategy. Freer, a shrewd businessman and ambitious collector, approached Chinese art with a vision toward building an outstanding collection in the West. At his time, many major Euro-American collectors were focusing on high-value Ming and Qing ceramics and other decorative arts. In 1915, John D. Rockefeller Jr. paid over $1.5 million for a group of Ming and Qing porcelains, much in vogue from the Morgan collection through the renowned art dealer Joseph Duveen. So this shows the Rockefeller's New York residence filled with his Qing porcelains. Also, the Morgan collection was sold to other collectors, including Henry Frick. Although Freer had accumulated considerable wealth to buy art, his resources, however, were in no way comparable to those of his contemporaries, such as John D. Rockefeller Jr. To excel, Freer had to formulate his unique strategies based on his understanding of Chinese art and the market conditions. Freer collected smartly and selectively. focusing on neglected but unique or important types of objects. The availability of less sought-after items such as Chinese stone sculptures, ancient jades, and ceramics available at a relatively low price promised new opportunities. For example, while Rockefeller paid nearly $50,000 for a Qing period enamel porcelain figure in 1915, Freer acquired a year later this marvelous late 6th to early 7th century stone sculpture, the Standing Bodhisattva, for $4,500. From 1915 to 1919, the structure of Freer's Chinese collection changed as well. A comparison of his 1906 and 1916 Chinese acquisitions show that his collection not only grew in size, but also became well-rounded, with nearly every major category represented here in 1916. Categorically, in Freer's last 5 years, if you look at here, the total here, painting ranked the first, followed by metalwork, jade, ceramics, sculpture, and textile. In terms of price of each category, painting in Freer's 1916 acquisitions was the dominant category, both in total value and number. Freer was also buying sculptures and textiles of relatively high value per piece. Jade and metalwork stood out in number, but their average prices are lower than other categories. Prior to 1907, Freer's main interest was in ceramics, and occasionally he added a few paintings. But painting emerged as the most important category in 1909 and again in 1911, thanks to his visit to China. And Ingrid Larson has wrote a wonderful article on Freer's collecting of Chinese painting, if you want to learn more. It is in 1907 that Freer began to acquire a significant number of metalworks and sculptures. Compared to other categories, jade was a later comer. Freer began to collect jade in earnest in 1911 when he made his last visit to China and acquired nearly 30 pieces from Chinese dealers. But if you look at this table, in 1916 and 1917, ancient jade figured prominently in his Chinese collection. He purchased 146 pieces of jade in 1917, making jade the biggest category in his purchases of the year. Although the price of a small number of jade pieces were high, such as this dagger axe of the Erlitou period at the price of $6,000. The majority of Freer's jade purchases were in the price range of a few hundreds, such as this 4th to 3rd millennium BCE jade disc B from Liangzhu culture. In response to the asked price of $800 and $500 for 2 jade pieces from the Chinese dealer Wang Jiantang, Freer advised him in 1916, quote, "No one in America will pay such a very high price for jade, and I strongly advise you to send no more unless the price you put upon them are several 100% less." End quote. That's for $500 and $800. While collectors like Herbert Bishop were amassing 18th to 19th century Qing jades. Mike Kern showed us the Bishop collection on display at the Met in 1917. Charles Lam Freer built a distinctive, high-quality and substantial ancient jade collection at a reasonable cost in this new field of collecting. Freer's gifts form the core of Freer Gallery's ancient Chinese jade collection today, which contains the largest and the most significant group of jades from Liangzhu culture outside of China. So if you haven't visited our newly reinstalled jade gallery, I highly encourage you to do so. Freer's fascination with early jades was also deeply personal. Freer was attracted to their subtle hues, fine grains, smooth and cool surface. Moreover, as Kathleen Pye noted, when desperately ill at the end of his life, Freer would cling to certain pieces of jades for their mystical restorative power. Freer's interest in early Chinese art was also influenced by his advisor, Bertolt Laufer, who you have known, the anthropologist and curator of Asiatic ethnology at the Field Columbia Museum in Chicago. One of the pioneering American experts of Chinese language and culture, Laufer authored some of the earliest scholarly monographs on ancient Chinese art in the Western world, including Pottery of the Han Dynasty in 1909 and Jade, a study in Chinese archaeology and religion in 1912. Freer's acquisitions in his last few years evidenced the impact of Laufer's scholarship. So here on your left is a page featuring a tall jade tube tone in Laufer's jade book, and on the right is a Freer piece. And again, on the left is an illustration of a group of Eastern Han ceramic vessels from Laufer's book, and on the right is a Freer piece. It has been argued that Freer was an art for art's sake type of collector with an emphasis on aesthetic appeal of an object, and his connoisseurship of Chinese art was largely shaped by Japanese art scholars, dealers, and collectors. It is evident that between 1915 and 1919, Freer's Chinese collecting was deeply influenced by scholarship based on Chinese sources. Freer was in close contact with experts well-versed in Chinese language and culture, including Laufer, John Ferguson, and Ma Su, a painting expert from China. Upon Freer's request, Chinese scholars translated inscriptions on objects or wrote notes about Chinese artists. Freer was actively collecting Chinese language literature on painting, jade, and bronze related to his collection. His library held the catalogs of the jade and bronze collections of the famed collector Duan Fang. After acquiring 2 jade blades previously in Duan Fang's collection, Freer wrote to the Chinese dealer You Xiaoxi, quote, "I'm very anxious to know what the Chinese books say about the 2 jade swords bought from you. Will you kindly send me translations and give me the name of the book and the dynasty in which it was published? Information of this kind is very much needed in this country, where many people are becoming interested in ancient Chinese art," end quote. And another major factor that impacted Freer's Chinese acquisitions was America's entry into World War I in April 1917. And the shortage of transportation, as well as heavy increase in taxation. We hope that will never happen again. If we look at the year here, in 1917 and then 1918, you'll notice that Freer's purchases dropped from 398 to 73 in 1918. The lowest point in his last 5 years. In October 1917, the US Congress passed the War Revenue Act, increasing income taxes to unprecedented level to raise more money for the war effort. For incomes of $1 million, the rate went from 10.3% in 1916 to 73% in 1918. In 1918, the clause of the new war revenue bill was enacted. placing a tax of 10% on all artworks sold in the United States, except works by living artists. In 1919, a tax of 10% on works of art imported to the United States were levied. The heavy taxation meant large expenditure on the part of more wealthy art patrons and collectors like Charles Lamb Freer and his friends. 1 month after passage of the 1917 War Revenue Act, the Yamanaka and Company offered Freer the Rachel bronze set from the late collector Duan Fang, currently in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Although Freer considered this group the most interesting group of bronze thus far discovered in China, he stated, quote, "I'm sorry to say that I have no means with which to buy it, especially in these wartime days and the consequent uncertainty of income, the most of which, in my case, will go to the government, regardless of the much discussed income bill now before the Congress." End quote. 1 month after the passage of the Revenue Act, Freer wrote to the Chinese dealer You Xiaoxi, quote, "The money demanded for war purposes has very much lessened the purchases of Chinese art in this country, and until after the peace has been declared, I feel that it would be very risky to attempt to make further sales in this country. My friends have all practically stopped buying, and I am thinking seriously of doing likewise myself," end quote. Moreover, by April 1918, the shortage of shipping had led the American government to take steps to prohibit the importation of art objects. Due to all these wartime constraints, Freer's purchases from dealers in China paused. Between March 1918 and June 1919. And even worse, in addition to the increased taxation and the government restrictions, the rise in the price of silver and the resulting increase of the exchange rate of the US gold dollars to Chinese silver currency taels also affected transactions between Freer and art dealers in China. For example, in November 1917, the exchange rate of US gold dollars to Chinese tael rose from 0.72 to 0.90 in 14 months. This means if Chinese dealers converted 10,000 US dollars Freer paid them to Chinese taels based on the raised exchange rate, they would lose 2,900 Chinese taels. Although Freer significantly slowed down his pace of collecting during the war, he was still making Chinese acquisitions selectively, focusing on painting and jades. In early 1918, Freer acquired from the Chinese dealer Wang Jiantang 49 pieces at the price of $19,600. During the war, the law of supply and demand created new market conditions. In June 1918, when Freer was not buying art from Chinese dealers, he received from a Shanghai-based dealer, You Xiaoxi, a tantalizing report. Quote, "At the present time, owing to the disturbances in China, some collectors are willing to sell their works of art, which are valuable at very reasonable prices. But unfortunately, during the war, these goods, owing to the shortage of ships, cannot be imported into America. And consequently, there's a large accumulation of goods here and no ready money to purchase the really valuable works, which are now being offered at such moderate prices," end quote. Not buying from dealers in China between March 1918 and June 1919, Freer relied on the Japanese firm Yamanaka and Company as his major source of supply for Chinese art. Constraints imposed on art collectors in Europe and America might have led dealers to seek buyers elsewhere. So where? When Freer turned down the offer of the Duanfang Bronze Group, he advised the Yamanaka and the Company that they should consider the collector of ancient Chinese art, Mr. Sumimoto, in Japan. After the war ended, Freer resumed his business with dealers in China in 1919. The number of Freer's Chinese purchases from the gallery increased from 73 in 1918 to 178 in 1919. Although Freer passed away in September 1919, his last 5 years collecting of Chinese art left the gallery still imbuing many areas of a great strength. His interest in early Chinese art and Chinese scholarship led the foundation of the future Freer Gallery's work. Between 1915 and 1919, Freer's Chinese acquisitions came mainly from 19 dealers. These dealers are very different in their status. By the mid-1910s, firms such as Yamanaka and Company, funded by Yamanaka Sadajiro, had already been noted international establishments with office in New York. So here you see Yamanaka and his 680 Fifth Avenue shopfront currently is occupied by Gap. And an interior view of the shop. Yamanaka was in a privileged position to access American clients and to enjoy visibility. Without a permanent gallery in the US, the Shanghai-based dealers, such as Wang Jiantang, Li Wenqing, and You Xiaoxi, needed to travel to New York to meet their clients, or they had to have helping agents or partners. Dealers' relationship with Freer were also different. Yamanaka and Company, for example, was selling Charles Lam Freer Chinese things every year. A.W. Barr, for example, was doing business with Freer only in 1915 and 16. Dealers had a distinct area of specialization and their own selling strategies. A study of Freer's 1916 Chinese acquisitions from 10 dealers shows that dealers of Chinese origin, such as Li Wenqing and Wang Jiantang, concentrated on painting and jade. Non-Chinese firms dealt little in painting, but specialized in other areas. The prominent art dealer, Dikran Kalikian, for example, focused on high-end Chinese sculptures and textiles. In 1916, Kalikian sold Freer 8 pieces of sculpture at the average price of over $4,000 each, including this Tang Dynasty standing bodhisattva. In contrast, A.W. Barr supplied 177 objects, mostly low-value, small-scale metalworks, such as this bronze gammon hook for $5. During this period, one of the most significant changes in Freer's collecting activities was the formation of a special system between Freer and a small group of dealers in China. In his last 2 trips to China, in 1909 and then from 1910 to 11, Freer worked with a number of important Chinese collectors and dealers, from whom he bought a large number of works. Building on these connections, Freer no longer able to travel to China due to his deteriorating health. Freer had to rely on a select group of Chinese dealers who sourced objects for him direct from China. Such a system gave Freer access to a large quantity of high-quality Chinese artworks at competitive prices. In 1916, Freer acquired 105 objects from the Chinese dealer Li Wenqing at the price of over $86,000. 4 China-based dealers supplied over half of Freer's entire 1916 Chinese acquisitions of the year in value. Freer informed the dealers of his particular areas of interest. Dealers in China visited important sites, antique markets, and collectors to gather both excavated and heirloom objects. In a world without emails and iPhones, They sent Freer letters with photographs and descriptions, even produced catalogs for their collection for Freer and his fellow collectors. So here is the sale catalog of 60 Chinese paintings published by C.T. Lu's firm in Shanghai in 1916. Upon Freer's request, objects were shipped to Freer for inspection. In the transaction with Chinese dealer Yiyou Wang and Wang Jiantang, Freer was in a position to determine the final price. The amount Freer paid was usually 50 to 70% of the asked price. So why did Chinese dealers want to work with Freer in this manner? Chinese dealers had direct access to the sources of supply in China at prices probably much lower than the prices they asked. The Chinese dealers would still expect considerable profit even when Freer asked for a deep discount. On the other hand, still new to the art market in America without permanent galleries in New York or easy access to American collectors and museums, Chinese dealers chose to rely heavily on Freer, who had gained a reputation as a leading authority and collector of Chinese art with extensive connections to dealers, collectors, and museum curators. Freer willingly acted as a middleman between his trusted dealers and potential buyers of Chinese art to create a win-win situation for all parties involved. While building his own collection for the Freer Gallery, Freer had a sense of mission to spread Asian art among other museums and collectors. Toward this end, he often divided the collections offered by dealers between himself and his fellow collectors. For example, in 1915, C.T. Lu offered Freer at the price of $500,000 francs, that's over $85,000, a group of outstanding bronze and jade objects from the French dealer Marcel Bing. Among this group is this 11th century BCE ritual bronze grain server known as Tai Bao Gui, which documents an important historical moment in the early Western Zhou dynasty. The vessel was acquired by Freer's friend, Eugene and Agnes Myers, and later bequeathed to the Freer Gallery of Art. Freer's mode of operation was described by the Chinese dealer Yiyou Wang as such. When the goods arrived, you buy those you like best for your own purpose, and then sell the remainder to your friends and other museums. Freer offered dealers other kinds of practical help. In 1917, after 4 cases of jades, bronzes, ceramics, and paintings from the dealer Yiyou Wang arrived in Detroit from China, Freer offered to provide storage in the vault of his Ferry Avenue residence in Detroit for objects that he could not sell at the moment for the dealer to his friends, without any charge, of course. Freer also acted as dealer's financial advisor. In 1916, Freer financed the dealer Wang Jiantang's art purchases through a $10,000 loan agreement. According to Freer, if in the future Wang could bring him things that were satisfactory, Freer would apply the $10,000 loan on his purchases from Wang. Although Chinese porcelain had gained wide popularity in Europe and America earlier, Chinese painting, sculpture, ancient jades, and bronzes arrived in America in the 1910s as a relatively new category. Dealers of Chinese art served a growing but small band of American collectors. With limited resources and visibility, dealers collaborated, unable to come to the United States. The Shanghai-based dealer and collector of painting, Pang Yuanji, had C.T. Lu and Yiyou Wang to represent him in his transaction with Freer. In the mid-1910s, the Paris-based dealer C.T. Lu was in partnership with Guan Fuchu, a prominent Shanghai-based dealer and painting expert, who helped Lu to secure paintings from collectors across China. The ownership of an object can be transferred among dealers as well. This 6th century stone barrel couch front, for instance, was imported by C.T. Lu from China to France, and then sold to the French dealer Charles Vignier, and then Lu purchased back from Vignette before selling it to Charles Lanfrier. On the other side of the picture, dealers compete against each other to win Freer's favor. C.T. Lu was a major supplier of Chinese painting and jades to Freer in 1915. A year later, 3 other Chinese dealers came to the scene with similar type of items. In 1916, Lu offered Freer 60 paintings at $60,000. When Freer asked for a much lower price, Lu insisted on $60,000 because he told Freer's offer was less than the cost of the collection. Freer, who considered himself to be the absolute authority, was offended and decisively ended any further transaction with Lu after 1916. Although dishonesty on Lu's part might be a main reason why Freer made such a decision, it is also evident that Lu's presence was no longer critical to Freer's Chinese art collecting. In 1916, Freer, approached by dealers who allow him to set the final price, made at least 6 important transactions, including 100 paintings from Li Wenqing at the average price of $650 per piece. In comparison, Lu's offer at average price of $1,000 per piece seemed less competitive. Now, to end my talk, I would like to take you to the journeys of Chinese objects. Chinese objects acquired by Freer followed 2 main routes in their global journeys from China to the United States. One route is illustrated by the journeys of this burial couch front. It was first sent to C.T. Lu's gallery in Paris from China, probably via the Trans-Siberian Railroad, then shipped to the United States across the Atlantic. The other route was first to cross the Pacific Ocean from Shanghai to reach Vancouver or San Francisco as port of arrival, then to Detroit as the port of entry via freight train. Before shipping their offerings to Freer, Chinese dealers obtained an invoice from the United States Consular Office in Shanghai. We learned from this consular invoice of September 15, 1917, that 1 case of Chinese paintings, including this Ming hanging scroll, was sent from the Chinese dealer Wang Jiantang to Freer, packed in a tin-lined case with paper. They were shipped from Shanghai to Freer's residence in Detroit on the ship SS Ecuador. The invoice also contained information about the value and the contents of the shipment, cost of freight, duties, insurance, and consulate fee. But if you look at the total value of 4,000 Mexican silver dollar, it's problematic because the correspondence between dealers and Freer revealed that Chinese dealers often put in the consular invoice a much lower value for their goods, sometimes only 10% of the actual price they asked. So the last slide I want to show you is we need to be very careful when we look at export statistics and also look at it very critically because this might just be a tip of the iceberg. If dealers or repeat that kind of practice, so you will see actually the actual scale of the Chinese art trade between dealers and Charles Lanfrier and other collectors in the United States was probably much more impressive. And also to end my presentation, I want you to call your attention to 2 concepts I think that's kind of common threads in all our talks. One is the idea of complexity. So here we're looking at collecting Chinese art in America, but we also have to look at what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Japan. And also another idea is interconnectivity. Because, for example, here you see dealers, collectors, and scholars and curators of Chinese art formed a small but close-knit circle. Of course, in the first half of the 20th century, Chinese art dealers played a very important role in shaping many major collections because of their access to resources. But on the other hand, you also see that all those roles can cross over in the case of, for example, John C. Ferguson. And also in terms of methodology, we are looking at very complex factors, art historical, personal, political, and economic. And I think that all makes the history of collecting such a fascinating field for interdisciplinary study. That's why we're all here. Thank you.